Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. Today's opinions will be about Black Powder War by Naomi Novik. So this is the third book in the Temeraire series, which I have absolutely loved up to this point. The premise of this series is basically the Napoleonic Wars with dragons. Our lead characters are Will Lawrence, who used to be a naval captain, but accidentally became the captain of a dragon in the British Aerial Corps, and his dragon, Temeraire. Now, in the last book, Lawrence and Temeraire and their crew ended up having to go to China because it turns out that Temeraire is a Chinese celestial dragon who really was not supposed to end up in the hands of the British Aerial Corps. But after a buttload of political machinations and just enough action to keep things interesting, they're finally heading home. But before they can leave China, they get orders for a new mission. On the way home, they need to stop in Istanbul and pick up some freshly purchased dragon eggs. A mission with a distinct time limit because at least one of the eggs is getting ready to hatch. On the way home, they will run into feral dragons, more political machinations, a other celestial dragon who is determined to see them as the worst enemies ever, and the war in Prussia. So the theme I keep going back to with this series in my reviews is the tension between historical period tone and modern sensibilities. Naomi Novik puts these little in-universe essays and nonfiction segments into these books, and the one in this book really struck me for that tension. The essay here is presented as some random learned man who has absolutely no reason to think himself an expert on the topic of dragons, and yet still feels the need to express his opinions about how all the experts are wrong and dragons cannot possibly actually be sentient because reasons. And I actually had trouble reading it. It felt exactly like reading the kind of bullshit that was written throughout the 1800s about how women, people of color, and the poor couldn't possibly deserve the rights of wealthy white men because they wouldn't know what to do with them. They're children who need to be led. And it reads as painfully authentic. And I think that besides being there because it's important to the story to see the contrast of what Temeraire is fighting, and it's clearly setting up what's going to be a major conflict in the next book, I think this essay is in this book to provide a contrast to our main characters. Compared to the bullshit we read in that, the jarring thoughts and odious opinions that we see from otherwise admirable characters in this book, it's just mildly problematic. So in the first two books, I felt that Novik did an exceptional job of managing that tension between the characters feeling like they legit could be from the 1800s, and yet not being odious to read. Lawrence is clearly a bit stuck up, he's sexist, he's classist, but if you were to take him out of these books and put him in actual works from the 1800s, he would be the paragon of progressive thought. And importantly, we get to see him learn. We get to see him realize that women can be good soldiers, that manners are not nearly as important as actual virtues, and that the British way of doing things is not always the most civilized. This book, though, I felt managed it just a little less well. I still like Will Lawrence and the other characters, but there are so many moments in this book where he is thinking or saying things that are just ever so slightly classist or royalist or Anglo-centric that it gets a bit annoying. I think part of it is that he's being set up for some major character development in the rest of the series, but also huge portions of the plot of this book are built largely on Lawrence's sense of honor, which is tied to his sense of responsibility, which is tied to his nobility, which is tied to his feelings about kings and Napoleon. If Lawrence did not inherently believe in the right of the kings to rule, he would not have stayed in Prussia, and about 200 pages of this book would not exist. Also, frankly, Lawrence sort of has to disapprove of French generals that were peasant-born, because he's a fucking English nobleman from the 1800s. I would not believe him as a character if he did not have some rather classist thoughts about that. But as a person who was born into a society that sees inherited nobility as an inherently broken system and meritocracy as at least what we're trying to achieve, it's hard to like Lawrence when he's insulted by that. And that makes me think about why we like reading period fiction in the first place. They almost necessitate characters who are going to be seen as problematic to our modern day sensibilities. Or, like in Before We Disappear, they just decide to throw out accuracy and instead imagine a world where no one would be homophobic in Seattle in 1909. But that's not the way most period fiction works. Most of it is trying to be historically accurate. And I think the reason that we like these books, that we read them, is basically to try to understand the way people think in the past, but more importantly, to imagine ourselves being one of the few who is better than our time. Lawrence both is better than his time, but is also very much a creature of his time. And sometimes I just wasn't in the mood. And I have to say, I read this book when I was in a pretty bad place. My mom was in the hospital at the time. And so I think part of the reason I was hyper aware of the moments that Lawrence was being just a bit too time period appropriate for my tastes was just I was already in a bad mood. But there are also a couple of other random moments in this book that I was just not particularly fond of. There's a weird passing moment where it's made clear that Temeraire just masturbated in front of his entire crew. And I know it was there as part of the characterization that dragons are just distinctly not human, and specifically they lack the traditional modesty that would have been seen as the norm of the time. And it's vaguely funny, but it sort of just led me reading going, what? Why? There's another moment where Lawrence accidentally sees a woman from the Sultan's harem buck naked, and she is described in just enough precise detail to feel like this is going to be important. And yet, all it seemed to be doing there was showing us Lawrence being embarrassed to see a naked woman by accident. Beyond that, I was a bit annoyed in the last book that Novik had made Lien the villain, because it felt a little bit predictable and obvious, but I actually really like Lien being the continuing enemy in this book. I didn't particularly like her villain monologuing moment that she has about halfway through the book, because it felt a bit like reading a Bond movie suddenly, but overall she's a logical, believable threat, who makes a serious impact on the story and is an interesting addition to the war. I like the fact that she actually ends up being a serious catalyst for the change that Temeraire wants, even while she's trying her damnedest to ruin his life. And she shows something that I really like about this particular series, and that is that the enemy isn't always a villain. Lien is actually a character that you can empathize with pretty easily. And like, people talk about Napoleon being bad, and he's definitely the driving force behind this deadly war, but when we actually see him, he's presented as intelligent, prosaic, egalitarian, and not cruel. You could almost imagine that if they weren't on opposite sides of the war, Lawrence and him could be friends. And hell, Lawrence actually dislikes a lot of the people on his side of the war. There is certainly a place in fiction for truly evil antagonists. But especially when you're dealing with a story that features characters that were real people, I really appreciate the fact that the antagonists here are not shown as caricatures. They are likable, admirable, and, for lack of a better word, human. I think there's also something really interesting going on in this book with the war itself. There are subtle moments throughout that show the armies are just traipsing over the peasantry. The peasants seem to distinctly want Napoleon to win, and many of the soldiers are seen as being moved about like pawns by powerful men. And yet our protagonist 100% believes that Napoleon is a tyrant who must be stopped at all costs. It creates a really odd contrast, and at this moment, I really just want to see where the rest of the series goes with this, because I feel like it is going somewhere with it. There's plenty that I absolutely loved about this book. I really loved Temeraire's emotional journey as a budding activist. I really love the fact that Novik avoided the easy, expectable story of having Lawrence mistrust Tharke because of his mixed-race heritage, and instead gave him actual real reasons to both mistrust and trust the man. I loved the feral dragons that we meet. There's a lot of really well-written action, though in this book, like in many war books, there's such a high death toll that I start to wonder if the math makes sense. Like, I started to wonder how many people were originally part of Temerair's crew, because I feel like we've killed at least an entire crew's worth of people at this point. But objectively, what I still love about these books the most is just the relationship between the stuffy, honor-bound, slightly pretentious, but surprisingly down-to-earth Will Lawrence, and the childlike yet intelligent, protective, hopeful, aggressive Temeraire. They are a really fun contrast. Also, I'm honestly enjoying learning about the Napoleonic Wars, which is a topic I don't know that much about. I never really cared about learning the minutiae of wars, like who fought whom, where, with how many troops, and what formations, with what losses. I just don't have an interest, which is a bit hilarious because my dad absolutely loves that stuff. Like, he can probably tell you exactly which general fought in which formation in which position in every single battle in the Civil War. But it's just not my thing. To be completely honest here, war is not my thing. I love history, but when it comes to the war parts, you can literally just tell me who won and move on and I'm done. But it turns out, if you add dragons, it is my thing! I am suddenly not just interested, but I'm actually pausing reading to go look up maps and read about the actual battles to see how they differ from what's going on in the book. So yeah, I'm actually sitting here wanting to immediately pick up the next Temeraire book, specifically to find out who won the Napoleonic War, which I'm pretty sure I already know. So I'd say these are good books, even if I do have occasional problems with them.